My family thinks I walked away to save myself. The truth? I left because if I stayed one more day, something far darker would have happened. Welcome to Reddit Toxic Family Telltales channel. New episode every day. I'll never forget the day my friend Naomi called me, her voice trembling as she begged me to sit with her while her father took his final breaths. She couldn't face it alone. But before I even got to the hospice, she warned me about someone, her brother Carl. She hadn't seen him in years, not since he was kicked out of every family gathering for his violent outbursts. And now he was on his way back. Inside the quiet, sterile hospice room, her father lay still, his body battered by a massive stroke. He couldn't talk, couldn't move, just shallow breaths and twitching eyelids, like he was trapped inside a nightmare he couldn't wake from. Naomi whispered that Carl's flight had landed, and he'd be there by 2 o'clock. The moment she said his name, the heart monitor spiked so hard it set off alarms. It climbed even higher when she mentioned the time. Then it settled, but the air in that room was heavy. It was noon and Naomi's phone was blowing up with Carl's texts, short, aggressive, coming in like machine gun fire. She kept glancing at the door, her leg bouncing non-stop, like she was bracing for something awful to come walking through. Her dad's breathing grew harsher, ragged, until the nurse came in to adjust the morphine. But just as she reached over, his hand shot up and latched onto Naomi's wrist with shocking force. His eyes snapped open, wild, panicked, like he was trying to scream without a sound. My heart jumped into my throat. The nurse brushed it off as just spasms, but the way he stared at us? No, he was trying to say something. By 1 o'clock, Carl texted that he was 20 minutes out. The old man's body writhed against the bed, his pulse skyrocketing. Naomi tried calming him, whispering, "Daddy, please save your strength," but he kept darting his eyes between the door and her face. His lips moved desperately, repeating the same shapes. She shoved a notepad into his hand, but his fingers trembled too much to hold the pen. He scratched out a single jagged C before the pen slipped away. Naomi broke down sobbing, clutching his hand. "I know, Daddy. You want to see Carl? He's almost here, just hold on." At 1:30 on the dot, Carl filled the doorway and the whole room changed. Every machine went off at once, shrieking like an omen. And Carl? He was even scarier than Naomi described. Towering, broad shoulders filling the frame, prison tattoos snaking up his neck, but dressed in a sharp suit that looked like a mockery of respectability. He didn't even glance at his father first. His eyes went straight to Naomi. Cold. Cruel. And the first words out of his mouth? "Jesus Christ, Naomi, you got fat. Just like Mom." Then he strolled to the bedside, grabbed his father's frail hand and crushed it inside his fist. I swear I saw the old man flinch in pain. Carl smiled, dead eyes, sharp teeth, and said, "Hey Pops, miss your favorite son?" The fear that washed over that dying man's face. I've never seen terror like it. Carl launched into this venomous rant, claiming Naomi had turned their father against him, stolen everything, ruined his reputation. With every accusation, he squeezed harder until the monitor was shrieking. Naomi reached for the nurse's call button, but Carl yanked it out of the wall like it was nothing. His voice dropped low, calm, almost polite. "We're having family time. Don't ruin it." That calmness was worse than yelling. It made my skin crawl. The old man strained to speak, lifting his other hand toward Naomi, tears filling his eyes, while Carl held him in a crushing grip. Then Carl bent close and whispered something in his father's ear. Whatever it was, it broke him. The old man started thrashing, his whole frail body slamming against the rails. Naomi rushed to help, and Carl shoved her so hard she smacked into the wall, a photo crashing to the floor in shards of glass. I jumped up, but his dead gaze cut straight through me. "Sit down or I'll make sure you're in the bed next to him." And I believed him. When the nurse entered moments later, Carl flipped like a switch, instantly the doting son, stroking his father's hand with mock tenderness. The second she left? Back to the monster. He muttered about that night 5 years ago when it all went wrong, while his father sobbed silently beneath his grip. Then Carl's phone rang. He stepped out to take the call, but not before threatening, "Don't move an inch." The instant he disappeared, Naomi's dad clawed at my wrist with surprising strength, dragging me close. His lips worked frantically, barely a breath escaping, but I could read the words. Over and over, the same phrase. I shoved the pen into his hand again, steadying it as best I could. Together, we scratched letters onto the paper, shaky but legible. Carl walked back in just as the final letter was scrawled. And then everything stopped. The old man's body went limp. The monitor flatlined. Carl rushed forward, crocodile tears already streaming as nurses swarmed with the crash cart. He stepped back, shoulders shaking in a performance so convincing I almost questioned what I knew. Almost. Because I still had the notepad clenched so tightly in my fist my knuckles were bone white. And written across that page in trembling letters were the words, **, Carl poisoned me. **. For 20 minutes I stood frozen as the medical team fought to bring him back, Naomi silently sobbing at my side, while Carl put on the act of his life. When the doctor finally called it, 2:17 p.m., Carl collapsed into a chair, head in his hands, then pulled Naomi into a suffocating hug. His voice cracked just enough for the audience of nurses. "At least we were both here when Dad passed." But over his shoulder I saw Naomi's face, eyes wide with panic, her arms limp at her sides. And I knew she wasn't hugging him back. The hospice director came in not long after, clipboard in hand, ready to go over the paperwork. And of course Carl jumped up instantly, taking over like he was the man in charge. He started signing forms, nodding along, arranging the funeral home as if it was his birthright, while Naomi sat frozen in her chair. Her eyes stared through the floor, completely hollow, like she wasn't even in her body anymore. I slid my phone out and texted her, *, do you want to step outside? Get some air? *, she barely shook her head. No. She wasn't about to leave Carl alone with anyone who might ask questions. I understood. He kept laying it on thick with the director, *, it's so sudden. Dad was doing fine just yesterday, right? That's what the nurses told me. His performance of shocked grief made my skin crawl. It wasn't until an hour later that we finally stepped out into the parking lot. And the second the night air hit her, Naomi collapsed against me, sobbing so violently I thought she might pass out. She clutched my arms like I was the only thing keeping her standing. Between gasps she begged, "Please, don't go to the police yet. I need to think. I need to figure out what to do." I pulled the notepad from my pocket and opened it to the shaky handwriting. Her dad's words. Naomi traced each letter with her trembling fingers as tears slid onto the page. Her voice cracked. This could be wrong. Maybe he was confused. Maybe the medicine made him imagine it. But her face betrayed her. Deep down she already knew. We both did. Not after what we saw in that room. Not after the way her father reacted to Carl. That night, back in my apartment, I checked every lock. Twice. I yanked my curtains shut and sat there in the dark, knowing Carl had seen me, knowing he watched me help his dad scrawl those final words. My hands shook as I finally picked up the phone and dialed the non-emergency police line. Whispering, I asked if I could talk to someone about a suspicious death. Detective Dexter Hardy arrived within the hour. He was the steady, gray-haired man who immediately put on gloves before taking the notepad from me like it was a sacred artifact. We sat at my kitchen table while he pressed for details, every look, every sound, every moment I remembered. I told him about the call button ripped out of the wall. The terror in Naomi's dad's face. The timeline that didn't add up. Hardy slid the note into an evidence bag and told me straight, an autopsy was the next step. He didn't sugarcoat it, cases in hospice are messy, but he promised they'd treat it seriously. While he was still there, Naomi called me in tears. Carl wouldn't stop blowing up her phone, demanding answers about the funeral. Why hasn't the body been released yet? He kept asking. Why are you dragging this out? Her voice cracked as she admitted, *, I haven't told him about the police, but he'll figure it out. He always figures everything out. *. Hardy took the phone and spoke with her for 10 minutes, telling her to save every text, every voicemail. Document everything, he said firmly. The next morning I woke to a text that made my blood run cold. From Carl, *, I know what you told them. Lying about a grieving son, that's a new low, *, my hands went numb. I screenshot it immediately, sent it straight to Hardy. He called back within minutes, telling me to keep records of everything, to change up my routes to work, to stay alert at all times. That same afternoon, Hardy called again. Nurse Darla Palmer had officially filed a report about Carl ripping the call button out of the wall. She'd been in hospice for 15 years and swore she'd never seen a family member do something like that. She also mentioned the father's heart rate had spiked in a way she'd never witnessed, just at the mention of Carl's name. And then Hardy uncovered something even more chilling. Security footage. Carl's keycard had been scanned at the staff entrance at 12:50 p.m., a full 40 minutes before he arrived in the room at 1:30. And that same morning, the medication log showed unusual access patterns, around the exact time Carl was already inside the building. Nothing solid enough to put cuffs on him yet, but enough to make my stomach twist. 2 days later, the medical examiner's office put a hold on the body. Dr. Zara Aurora herself explained that it meant Carl couldn't push through the rushed cremation he'd been demanding. Naomi met me at the office to sign the papers. Her hands shook so badly she could hardly grip the pen. She kept glancing over her shoulder like Carl might appear out of nowhere. Her phone buzzed mid-signature. Carl. She put it on speaker and his voice filled the room, smooth, rehearsed, dripping with concern. He accused us of dishonoring their father, said grief makes people see things that aren't real, that the family needed closure. I watched Naomi's face crumble, her resolve wavered just from the tone of his voice. He knew exactly where to push. When the call ended, Dr. Aurora led us downstairs into the cold, bright autopsy suite. Cameras clicked. She photographed every inch of the body, explaining step by step. She pointed to the 4 sites, comparing them against the chart. And then she found them. 3 tiny punctures on his torso. 2 more on his arms. None of them matching any official 4 placements. Fresh. Unexplained. And in that moment I realized, her father hadn't just been afraid of Carl. He'd known exactly what was coming. The next morning I had to go down to the courthouse and meet with a victim's advocate. She was this older woman, calm and steady, the kind of person who looked like nothing could rattle her after all the cases she'd seen. She sat with me, walked me through the next steps, and helped me file for a restraining order against Carl. She warned me flat out that in family murder cases like this, witness intimidation wasn't just possible, it was almost guaranteed. Then she downloaded an app onto my phone, a panic button that would send my location straight to law enforcement if Carl ever showed up. I can't even explain the pit I felt in my stomach just knowing I might need it. Right in the middle of that meeting, Detective Hardy called. His voice was clipped, serious. He'd dug into Carl's background and found something massive. Carl had gotten out of prison only 8 months ago. None of his family even knew. The charge? Aggravated assault. And Hardy had gone back further. 15 years of police reports, arrests for battery, threatening behavior, violent outbursts, it was a pattern, one after the other. Hardy laid out the timeline he'd built, Carl's texts, his supposed flight arrival, the visitor log at the hospice. The badge scan showed Carl officially checked in at 1:30 p.m. The time of death was 2:47 p.m. That left a critical 40-minute window where Carl had been inside the building before showing up in the room, and the timeline fit like a puzzle. Those were the minutes where he could have done something to his father. Later that day, Naomi and I sat in front of the prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Hamilton Pope. He was tall, wiry, with bags under his eyes that made him look like this case was already keeping him up at night. He spread every piece of evidence across his desk and told us the truth. Prosecuting a murder in hospice care was brutal. People were already dying. You had to prove intervention, not just natural decline. He said he needed the full autopsy results before even thinking about charges. That same afternoon, Dr. Aurora called us to the morgue. She explained how toxicology worked, then drew fluid from behind the father's eyes, vitreous fluid. She told us it was one of the most reliable tests for detecting insulin poisoning because it could pinpoint blood sugar levels at the exact time of death. If Carl had used insulin, it would show up right there. While we waited, Nurse Darla Palmer came forward with even more details. She described how the father's grip on Naomi's wrist had been far too strong for a man who was supposedly paralyzed. In all her years, she'd never seen anything like it. She also told Hardy something new. That morning, someone had requested an increase in morphine, but when she went to give it, the father reacted violently. The order had been entered through the medication terminal, but it didn't have a name attached. Hardy dug into the hospice pharmacy records and uncovered something chilling. An extra insulin pen had been logged into the refrigerator that week with no patient name assigned to it. On top of that, the security footage for the pharmacy area had been corrupted, deliberately. IT confirmed it looked like tampering, not a glitch. Which meant someone inside the hospice might have been helping Carl cover his tracks. Hardy started pulling staff files, looking for anyone with a history of cutting corners. 3 employees had violations in the past year. One of them? On duty the very morning Carl showed up early. Meanwhile, Naomi unraveled more every day. She stayed at my place most nights because Carl kept turning up at her apartment, ignoring every boundary, every order. The case was moving forward, but Carl always seemed to be a step ahead. 3 days later, Naomi appeared at my door pale and shaking. She handed me her phone. On it, a thread of messages from her father, just 3 months old. They showed he'd made her his medical power of attorney, cutting Carl out completely. He'd even sent her photos of the signed documents. Naomi's voice cracked as she whispered how sick it made her feel that money was part of this now. I told her it wasn't about money, it was about control. About Carl losing the one thing he thought he owned, power over the family. The very next morning, Hardy called again with bad news. Carl had hired a defense attorney, a big name, Delaney Red. She'd already sent out preservation letters to the hospice and police, trying to lock down evidence. In the media, she was painting Carl as a grieving son harassed by overzealous cops. Her whole narrative was natural death, bitter relatives can't accept it. Hardy said Red was notorious for getting guilty people off on technicalities. That same day, Hardy played us voicemails Carl had left him. In one, Carl claimed the morphine was killing his dad and he'd only stepped in to save him. His voice was steady, rehearsed. In another voicemail from 2 days earlier, he gave a completely different version about just wanting quality family time. Each story contradicted the last. And then Hardy pulled up security footage from the hospice hallway. We watched frame by frame as Carl ripped the call button straight out of the wall at 1:47 p.m. The very next second, when the nurse walked in, he transformed into the grieving son, tears streaming as he clutched his father's hand. The switch was instant, terrifying to watch. Hardy muttered, "This is what will kill his act in court." 2 days later, Dr. Aurora summoned us back. She'd been combing the body with a magnifying glass. And she'd found something, a puncture wound, tiny, tucked low on the abdomen where no one would look. It didn't match any official foresights. She measured it, photographed it from every angle. Her voice was steady when she said it. It's exactly the right size for an insulin injection needle. Hidden. Deliberate. Almost invisible. And with that discovery, the whole case shifted. This wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was the first undeniable mark of a hidden hand. Hardy took the notepad straight to the crime lab. I'll never forget standing there as the tech swabbed and dusted, pulling up fingerprints. Mine. Naomi's. And her father's. Hardy explained, gently but firmly, that Carl's lawyer would absolutely argue the note had been contaminated. That we'd handled it too much. He made me rehearse over and over how I would testify about the chain of custody, how the note went from Naomi's dad's hand to mine and straight to the police. Every second had to be airtight. A few days later, a health aide named Maria came forward. She'd been restocking supplies around noon that day and swore she saw Carl standing at his father's pump. His back was turned, his hands fiddling with the tubes. At the time, she brushed it off, but now she wondered if he'd been adding something. She remembered it vividly because when she passed, Carl snapped at her, told her to give him privacy. Not long after, the housekeeping supervisor showed up with something she'd saved from the trash. A small plastic cap she found in the bin right outside the father's room during the deep clean after he died. It was from an insulin pen needle. She said something about that day hadn't felt right, so she kept it. The lab tested it, but there wasn't much to go on. Standard insulin, no batch code, no serial number, no usable fingerprints. Just another haunting piece of circumstantial evidence. ADA Pope sat us down again, spreading the paperwork across his desk. He told us point blank, he wanted to wait for the toxicology before making any moves. Jumping too early would give Carl's lawyer an opening to tear the case apart. He explained how brutal hospice murder cases are. People expect death there. Juries need rock-solid evidence to believe someone pushed it along. The insulin pen with no name, Carl's hidden prison record, they were pieces of the puzzle, but not enough yet. Meanwhile, Carl didn't let up. Naomi spotted him parked outside her gym, just sitting in his car, eyes fixed on her through the window. I caught him at the grocery store one night, 3 aisles over, pretending to shop while his gaze tracked me. He never said a word, never stepped close, so technically he wasn't breaking any laws. Hardy told us it was deliberate. He was trying to keep us scared without giving police an excuse to haul him in. The toxicology trickled in slowly, torturous pieces at a time. The blood work showed some oddities, but nothing conclusive. The key test, the vitreous fluid Dr. Aurora had pulled from behind the father's eyes, was still pending. That fluid could tell us blood sugar at the exact time of death. If it came back fatally low, it would be the proof we needed of insulin poisoning. But the samples had been sent to a specialized lab 3 states away. And every day without answers left us more vulnerable. 2 days later, Carl's attorney, Delaney Red, filed motions to block the autopsy photos from the press. That same afternoon, she paraded across 3 different news stations, smiling for cameras while she painted Carl as the perfect grieving son. According to her, this was all family drama, Naomi and I twisting a natural death into a crime out of spite. The next morning, my phone exploded with notifications. A local blog had posted my full name, calling me a liar who was chasing attention and money. The comment section was a feeding frenzy, strangers demanding I be arrested, some even posting my work address. People dug up my Instagram photos and plastered them online with disgusting remarks. I spent hours deleting every social media account I had, but the screenshots were already everywhere. By that afternoon, my boss pulled me into his office. Customers had been calling, asking why he employed a liar. 3 days later, I was stocking shelves by the front windows when I felt it, that weight of someone watching me. I looked up and there he was. Carl. Standing on the sidewalk, hands in his pockets, wearing that same cold little smile. My hands shook so violently I dropped the box of coffee filters I was holding. I bolted to the back office and dialed 911, gasping that a man I had a restraining order against was outside. By the time the cops arrived 20 minutes later, Carl was gone. The officer listened politely but shrugged. Carl had been on a public sidewalk, hadn't said anything, hadn't come inside. Technically, he'd broken no laws. Even the photos I'd snapped of him standing there weren't enough. That night, Hardy called me with one sliver of hope. They had Carl's phone records. His phone had connected to the hospice Wi-Fi at 12:50 p.m., 40 minutes before he pretended to walk in at 1:30. The signal stayed connected the whole time, proving he'd been in the building long before he showed his face in the room. The Wi-Fi logs were concrete, undeniable. The crime lab finished processing the needle cap too. They found DNA, but it was muddled, at least 3 different contributors, too degraded to match to anyone. Dr. Aurora explained it was typical for medical waste. Multiple people handled it, and harsh cleaning chemicals broke down the profiles. She documented it all, but it wouldn't stand in court. Then finally, the preliminary toxicology report came back. Dr. Aurora called us in. She looked exhausted but resolute. The glucose level in the vitreous fluid was dangerously unnaturally low, far below what even a dying patient's body would register. It was consistent with insulin overdose, fatal hypoglycemia. She warned us, organs failing at the end of life can drop glucose, but not like this. Not this far. Her conclusion was quiet, almost solemn. Combined with everything else, homicide is probable. Probable. But she also warned that with a defense like Delaney Red's, they'd argue it was natural. And the weight of that word, probable, hung in the air like a curse. That night, Naomi finally let the dam break. She told me everything she'd been too ashamed to share before, the ugly truth about their family. When Carl was a teenager, their dad used to beat him. Bad. Sometimes with a belt, sometimes with his fists. But Carl wasn't just a victim. He'd step in when their dad turned on Naomi, throwing himself in the way and taking the brunt of it to protect her. Tears streamed down her face as she choked out that part of her hated herself for pressing charges now. She knew Carl had killed their father, but she also knew their father wasn't innocent either. Her voice cracked as she whispered, maybe he had reasons, even if what he did was wrong. That night I started keeping my own notebook. Not just the facts of the case, but the things eating away at me. How I checked my locks 3 times before bed. How I scanned every shadow when I walked outside. How being a witness felt like my life was slowly being stolen piece by piece. And most of all, how choosing justice meant dragging through the mud of a family where no one was completely innocent. Detective Hardy kept working, pulling every thread he could. He brought Darla Palmer back in to clarify her earlier statement. She swore that looking back, the father's eye movements weren't random at all. They were purposeful, tracking Carl around the room, trying desperately to warn us. But she knew the defense would argue it was just involuntary twitching. Then Hardy found something chilling in Carl's own text messages from that morning. At 8 a.m., Carl had sent someone a message, I'll make them feel it today. It could mean anything. But after what happened? It sounded like a promise. 2 days later, ADA Pope called me into his office. Papers spread across his desk. He said they weren't ready for murder charges yet, but they were filing for obstruction of justice and witness intimidation. He pointed to the hospice footage of Carl ripping the call button from the wall, and to the moment Carl threatened me about needing a bed next to his father. These charges would at least let them hold him while the bigger case built. I watched Pope's assistant walk the paperwork straight to the judge's chambers. By noon, Hardy was calling me from outside Carl's building. They had the warrant. I asked if I could be there to identify him, and Hardy agreed, if I stayed in his unmarked car a block away. Carl's place was a shiny luxury high-rise, the kind with a doorman and marble floors. I watched 6 officers march inside while Hardy coordinated from the curb. 20 minutes ticked by before they brought Carl out in handcuffs. He played it to perfection, loud enough for his neighbors to hear. There must be some mistake. What's this about? Asterisk, his voice dripping with innocence. But when they walked him past Hardy's car, he turned his head. His eyes found me through the glass. Flat. Empty. He mouthed something I couldn't catch before the officer shoved his head down into the patrol car. The bail hearing was 3 days later. Delaney Red swept into court in her power suit, arguing Carl was no threat, not a flight risk, just a grieving son scapegoated by bitter relatives. The judge's face softened as she spoke. The prosecutor fought back, pointing to Carl's threats, but Delaney brushed it off as me misinterpreting an emotional outburst. When the gavel came down, bail was set at $50,000. And just like that, Carl walked free that same afternoon. The victim's advocate met me the next morning with a stack of papers and a plan. We mapped out alternate routes to work. She had new locks installed on my apartment door and handed me a camera system that pinged my phone if anyone got close. I set up check-in times with 3 different friends, texting them a code word throughout the day to prove I was safe. It was exhausting, but at least it was something, steps to hold on to when the fear threatened to drown me. A week later, the forensic handwriting report came in. The examiner compared the note with samples of the father's writing before the stroke. Her conclusion was clear, the shaky letters were his. The pressure patterns matched someone fighting through impairment to communicate, not random spasms, not me guiding his hand. She even printed side-by-side photos for the case file. 2 weeks later, I sat across from Delaney in a deposition room, fluorescent lights buzzing above us. For 3 hours, she tried to shred me apart. She leaned in, accusing me of guiding the father's hand. She asked me to describe the angle of the pen, the pressure, the way I supported his fingers. Over and over, trying to twist my words, trying to make me doubt what I knew was true. I held firm, but every jab landed like a bruise. At one point, she even sneered that maybe I was just hungry for attention, or that Naomi and I were after inheritance money. And the worst part? It worked on people outside the courtroom. Delaney leaked the financial records showing Naomi would inherit about $200,000 after debts. A true crime blogger picked it up, spinning it into a story about Naomi having motive. The harassment hit her hard, messages accusing her of killing her own father for cash, threats filling her inbox. She had to shut down her phone, lock down every account. One night, Naomi broke down in my apartment, sobbing into her hands. She admitted she'd stopped Carl from seeing their father 6 months earlier. Their dad had actually wanted to reconcile, but Naomi was terrified. So she told Carl their father didn't want him around. Now she kept whispering, asterisk, maybe if I'd let them see each other he wouldn't have been so angry. Maybe none of this would have happened. Asterisk. Her guilt was eating her alive. And I realized, this nightmare wasn't just about Carl anymore. It was about the whole tangled mess of a family, tearing itself apart long before the day in that hospice room. Dr. Aurora finally called us back in with her full autopsy report. Her conclusion was firm but heavy. The cause of death was insulin overdose, and the manner of death was homicide. Still, she had to list the father's other medical conditions, his stroke, his weak heart, which she warned the defense would use to argue reasonable doubt. The science supports murder, she said carefully, but conviction isn't guaranteed. A few hours later, ADA Hamilton Pope spread the case file across his desk and told us he was filing second-degree murder charges against Carl. He didn't sugarcoat the risks. Juries hate convicting in hospice cases. Too many think the person was dying anyway. He looked at us, serious, almost apologetic, and said, "This may not stick, but we have to try." Naomi's hands trembled in her lap. I looked at her and we both nodded. We knew this fight was going to get uglier before it ever got better. My mind kept flashing back to that day in the hospice, the crash team pounding on the old man's chest while I clutched the notepad like it was life itself, my hands trembling so badly I could barely hide it in my pocket. Carl, crying on command. His arms wrapped around Naomi so tight she looked like a prisoner, his voice carrying loud enough for the nurses. Asterisk, at least we were both here when Dad passed. Asterisk, and Naomi's eyes, wide, panicked, frozen. The hospice director had come with a clipboard, and Carl seized control instantly, scribbling signatures like he owned the place while Naomi sat in shock. I texted her, asking if she wanted air, but she shook her head almost imperceptibly. Too scared to leave him alone with the officials. Later, in the parking lot, Naomi fell apart, sobbing in my arms, begging me not to call the police yet. I'd pulled the note back out, her father's broken handwriting spelling out his last plea. She traced the letters with her fingertips like maybe if she touched them long enough they'd change. That night in my apartment, I checked my locks 3 times, shut my curtains, and sat with my heart hammering until I finally whispered into the phone, "I need to talk to someone about a suspicious death." That was the first time I met Detective Hardy, calm and steady, his gloved hands lifting the notepad like fragile glass, his pen scratching as I poured out everything I'd seen. 3 weeks later, the preliminary hearing began. By then, the whole town had already picked sides. Online, strangers called us greedy liars or heroes, depending on the thread. I stopped reading altogether. Hardy told me to stay off social media and focus only on the case. The courtroom was standing room only when the first battle erupted, whether the father's note counted as a dying declaration. Delaney Red argued he'd been doped up on morphine, too confused to know what he was writing. Pope countered that he clearly understood he was at the end, that he summoned every ounce of strength to write those words. Darla Palmer testified first. Her voice shook, but she didn't waver. She told the court how the father's grip on Naomi's wrist was impossibly strong for a paralyzed man. How his eyes locked on Carl every time he moved. Delaney tried to chip away. Couldn't that have been spasms? Coincidence? But Darla stayed firm. "In 15 years, she said, I've never seen anything like it." Then it was my turn. My chest was tight as I swore in, my voice trembling as I described holding that pen steady while the father scraped out those words. Delaney hammered at me, suggesting I'd guided his hand, misread random scratches, maybe even wanted attention. At one point she sneered about inheritance money, and I had to stop, close my eyes, breathe so I wouldn't explode. I kept my testimony simple. The truth. Every detail the same. Dr. Aurora took the stand after me. She laid out the science calmly, explaining how the insulin levels in the eye fluid pointed to overdose. She was precise, professional, refusing to overstate, even acknowledging that end-stage failure can sometimes mimic the same results. Delaney tried to twist her answers, but Aurora held her ground with quiet authority. After 3 agonizing days, the judge ruled. The note was admissible as a dying declaration. The jury would decide its weight, but it was evidence. Delaney immediately tried to appeal, but the judge denied her. Naomi's testimony was the hardest to sit through. Delaney dragged their whole childhood into the open. She forced Naomi to describe the belt beatings, the fists, how Carl had once shielded her from their father's rage. Naomi was sobbing so hard she could barely get the words out, admitting their family was broken long before this trial. And the jury? They saw Carl through both lenses, victim and monster. Exactly how Delaney wanted it. 2 months in, Carl broke the no-contact order, circling Naomi's house 3 times in one day. A neighbor's doorbell camera caught it, and police arrested him. The judge revoked his bail for a week. Then Delaney got him out again, this time with a higher bond and an ankle monitor. The waiting months that followed nearly destroyed me. Endless motion hearings. Legal delays. My life whittled down to breathing exercises from my therapist, endless migraines, and checking my locks over and over every night before I could close my eyes. And even then, sleep never came easy. 6 months after Naomi's father died, Pope called us back into his office. His face was lined, his tone measured, like he'd already carried the weight of this conversation 100 times before. He laid it out, a plea deal. Carl would plead to manslaughter and witness intimidation, 12 years, with the possibility of parole in 8. Not murder. Not justice in its purest form. But prison guaranteed. We sat in that office for hours, going over every possible angle. Pope even pulled out a whiteboard, sketching 2 columns. One side, guaranteed time behind bars. The other, gamble everything at trial, life in prison if we won, or Carl walking out a free man if we didn't. Naomi twisted her father's old watch around her wrist again and again, the one she'd taken from his bedside table. Her hands shook so badly she couldn't hold her coffee steady. Pope had to slide the cup away before it spilled across his desk. I couldn't stop thinking about Carl's dead eyes that day in the hospice. How he'd crushed his father's hand while smiling. The thought of him walking free, my stomach twisted until I thought I'd be sick. Pope left us alone to talk. And Naomi broke. She sobbed into her hands, whispering she couldn't endure months of seeing Carl's face in a courtroom every single day. When Pope came back in, we told him to take the deal. 2 weeks later, we stood in court while Carl shuffled in wearing an orange jumpsuit. He never admitted guilt. Instead, he entered an Alford plea, acknowledging that the evidence could convict him while still clinging to innocence. The judge asked if he understood what that meant, if he accepted 12 years with parole possible in 8. Carl just nodded, flat, emotionless. When the shackles clicked closed around his wrists, Naomi squeezed my hand so hard I thought my bones might snap. Half a year passed before I saw her again. She looked lighter. Still scarred, but steadier. We met at her therapist's office, where she showed me the progress she'd made. She'd kept her father's house but reinforced it like a fortress, new locks on every door, cameras recording to the cloud day and night. She showed me the journal where she wrote nightly letters to her dad, working through the guilt. In the attic she'd found boxes of old photos, Carl as a little boy smiling before everything went wrong. She couldn't throw them away, even though just looking at them made her stomach turn. As for me, I still checked my locks 3 times before bed. Still parked under the brightest lights. Still sent my location whenever I went anywhere alone. The panic attacks weren't as frequent, but I still jumped whenever footsteps came up behind me. My therapist said that part might never go away. The plea deal left me uneasy. 12 years felt light. But Pope's statistics had been clear. Juries sometimes let killers walk when the victim was already dying. That fear that Carl could have walked out untouched haunted me more than the light sentence. And the Alford plea? It was Carl's way of twisting the knife. A way to go down without ever admitting the truth. Not long after, Darla Palmer contacted me about testifying before a state review board on hospice security. For 4 hours, I walked them through every detail of that day. Darla demonstrated exactly how Carl ripped the call button from the wall, how easily visitors could block staff. The board responded with sweeping changes, panic buttons that couldn't be disconnected, mandatory supervision for high-risk visitors. Small victories that felt monumental to us. Dr. Aurora sent me a copy of the medical journal where she'd published our case, anonymized but powerful. She outlined how insulin murders in hospice often slipped by undetected, written off as natural. She developed a new protocol for testing eye fluid in suspicious deaths. 3 states had already adopted it. Out of our nightmare came something that might save families we'd never meet. 8 months later, sentencing day came. Naomi and I sat in the back as Carl was brought in. He scanned the courtroom, his eyes locking on mine for a full 10 seconds before I broke the stare, staring down at my hands instead. The judge gave him the full 12 years and ordered restitution for Naomi's funeral expenses. We knew he'd never pay a cent, but hearing it said out loud mattered. Afterward, Naomi and I walked to the little coffee shop on 3rd Street, her dad's old spot, where he used to bring her for hot chocolate when she was small. We sat in a booth, jazz humming from the speakers, and for once we talked about normal things. Her new job at the library. My plan to go back to school for social work. Naomi still wore her father's watch. I still glanced over my shoulder too much. But in that coffee shop, with the weight of trials and lawyers and Carl's shadow finally behind us, it felt like maybe, just maybe, we'd found a way to keep living. Some wounds don't close cleanly. Some questions never get answered. But sitting across from Naomi that day, both of us scarred but not broken, it felt like the best ending we were ever going to get. Thanks for watching. Today's train wreck is over, but tomorrow's ride is already on track. Subscribe so you don't miss it.